There's an airplane going by. How's it going there, guys? So today I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. So I'm not going to be doing a movie review necessarily or anything like that. But rather just talk to you guys about a certain thing. And, yeah, this is just kind of something new that I'm trying. I don't know if I'm going to keep doing these. Let me know if you like these, though. But, yeah, I figured that I should definitely talk about this, since I think a lot of people, need to know about this kind of thing. So before I start, I just kind of want to give you guys, my second thoughts of the horror film that just recently came out called The Witch. If you guys saw my review of that, I gave that film a 4.5 out of 5. I love the film. And that's a very, very controversial movie. I don't know if you guys know about this, but there are people out there who absolutely love this film, and there are people out there who hate it. But in case you guys didn't see that review, The Witch is basically a film about a family who are supposedly being hunted by a witch. They kind of live by a forest, and they just have their own house, and they're doing their own thing, and they pretty much just think that they are experiencing witchcraft and stuff like that. So yeah, that's basically the whole entire film. A lot of people found it to be very slow and boring, including me. Not gonna lie, I found the movie pretty slow, while watching it. As a matter of fact, while watching this movie, in the movie theater, I was thinking to myself, like, yeah, this is pretty okay. A little too slow for my taste, but I'll probably give it like a 3.5 out of 5 when I get home to review it. And then the movie ended, and then right after the movie ended, I was like, wow, that was actually really good. I'm probably going to give it a 4, maybe, when I go home to review it. And so I go home, from the movie theater, and I'm thinking, like, man, that was actually really freaking good. Like, that was pretty amazing. I think I'm going to give it 4.5. And so I made my review, and I gave the film a 4.5, like I said. And then after... After that review, I started thinking about the movie even more, and this movie has literally been... What? This movie has literally been... Why can I not talk? This movie has literally been stuck in my head for, like, ever since I watched it. Like, this is a movie that really stuck with me. There's something about it that stuck with me, and I've kind of grown to love it. It's slowly growing on me, and it's definitely something that I myself would even consider to probably even be one of my favorite horror films to come out in the past, couple of years. Like, it's really, really good. And right now, as I'm sitting here talking to you, I would probably give this film a 5 out of 5, honestly. Like, I now think that this film it's a masterpiece. I flat out said that. It's a masterpiece. It is a modern horror masterpiece. And I'm going to explain to you guys why. And please just be aware that this is my opinion, you don't have to agree with me, that's, opinions are subjective, that's the whole point of, movie reviews and whatnot, is to give you guys my opinion. So it might be different from yours, and that's okay. But, I just want to kind of share with you guys, why I think The Witch is a masterpiece. And this is going to take a while for me to talk about, but, in order to talk to you about why I think The Witch is a masterpiece, I think we need to start by just talking about horror films in general, From however long movies have came out, there have been horror films. But the first group of horror films that really became popular came out in the 1920s, and this was an era known as the German Expressionist era, where there was a bunch of, German horror films that were coming out, such as Nosferatu, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, the Golem. You had a lot of those, kind of very gothic type horror films. There were those silent black and white films, with the words coming up every time somebody says something, and then you have like the creepy music, and the atmosphere of it was very just, a one-of-a-kind atmosphere. And back then, that kind of crap scared so many people. By today's standards, that those probably aren't as scary now, and, that's because they're, like, way outdated, definitely those movies came out almost 100 years ago, so... And then after that, there were horror films coming out in the 1930s and 1940s, and, you all know, like, what kind of movies these are. These are the Universal monster films. That was the big thing with horror films back then. You had Frankenstein's monster, you had Dracula, the Mummy, Creature from the Black Lagoon. Well, actually, that was 50s, but, the Wolfman. You had a bunch of those, classic Universal monsters. And those horror films that came out, in the 1930s and 40s were the kind of horror films where, there was some sort of monster involved who was gonna come and get you, and, they had, like, the big, dark, tall castles and the spooky graveyards, that kind of thing was what horror movies were all about back then. And then the 1950s came along, and the 1950s was somewhat of a strange era for horror films because there were a lot of sci-fi horror films that came out in the 1950s, kind of like War of the Worlds and The Day the Earth Stood Still, kind of movies like those with a lot of sci-fi elements to it came out back in the 1950s. And then after all that stuff, you started to get a lot of more realistic horror films. More specifically, ones that I want to mention are probably Psycho is definitely one I want to mention. Rosemary's Baby. I'm gonna first start by talking about Psycho. Psycho is one of the greatest horror films of all time, hands down, like, no doubt about it. It is one of the greatest horror films of all time, and I will tell you why. It is the very first horror film to actually give the viewer a sense of realism in that this actual thing could actually happen. Like, this is something that could be real. This is something, that could happen. They bring real-life events into horror. And Psycho was the first movie to do that, before, they had all these movies about monsters and dark castles and graveyards, like I said. Although those kind of movies, scared people, there was kind of a sense of fantasy to it, where it was more so, they knew that it was fake. But it was still scary. But Psycho was the first one to feature, like I said, real-life events, and, stuff that could actually happen, with serial killers and that whole sort of thing. They started bringing real life into it instead of rather just making, like, fantasy stuff with monsters and such. And Psycho is a film that really petrified people because of that fact. And that goes for Rosemary's Baby too. Rosemary's Baby is a film that scared a lot of people. It was a film that really made you feel for this character, and she, was portrayed so realistically, and she was a character who anyone can relate to, and she was doing, everyday events, or everyday things, just like how, you would in everyday life, and that's kind of what threw people off, was that horror movies began to be a lot more realistic, rather than just having, like, the monsters coming to get you whole thing back in the 1930s and 40s. Now horror movies were starting to become more realistic because people, wanted to, step it up with the horror genre to make movies more terrifying, and they did. And then the 1970s came along, and the 1970s is kind of like another very strange era of horror films, where there are a lot of, like, very psychological horror films coming out. Movies that kind of just, like, really mess with your head, kind of like Don't Look Now, is a movie that came out in the 1970s, considered to be a psychological horror film that really messed with a lot of people's minds. And so that psychological horror began to grow in the horror genre, and like I said, it took another, big step up in the horror genre. They went from, fantasy and monsters to real-life events to, now psychological things where they mix real-life events and some fantasy elements to kind of make it even more realistic because of the fact that, like I said, it's kind of psychological. And then the 1980s came along, and the 1980s was a great year for horror films. Arguably, probably the best decade for horror films ever. Because there were a lot of slasher films that came out that year. You got Friday the 13th, and Nightmare on Elm Street, countless other slasher films came out in the 1980s. Of course, Halloween was, technically considered like the first of the slasher genre, which came out in 1978, but that film was actually inspired by Psycho. And yeah, like that's another reason why I think Psycho is one of the greatest horror films of all time, because it's a movie that even today inspires horror films, and it's the first movie to add realism into horror. But there's a thing with 80s where, the 80s was kind of the decade where they began to do that horror trend, that most horror movies that come out today still follow, with there's 5, really dumb teenagers who are out in the woods, or, out having a party in a house or whatever. There's 5 teenagers in a group together. You have one that's, like a jock. You have another that's, that's a girl who's always having sex, who's always just horny and wants to have sex. And then you have a guy who's kind of like a smart guy, like, kind of like a scholar, and then you have the stoner or the drunk or, whatever, the comic relief, and then you have the final girl, as they call him, which is the final girl in a horror film who is always the last to live and is always the one, fighting off the main villain. That horror movies today still follow that formula, as a lot of you know. We are all familiar with how this works, with horror movies. And yeah, like I said, the 1980s was kind of the first decade to, start that whole trend. And yeah, because of this, there were also a lot of very cheesy horror films to come out in the 1980s and 1990s. Because the genre was slowly becoming to a point where they felt like they could satire them. And the 1980s was also the decade where they kind of blended comedy and horror together, and they started making horror comedies. So then comedy horror began to be a thing. I don't know if you guys can hear that airplane, but it's really bugging me. It's like circling my house, and I'm trying to do this review. Can you shut up? And then in the 1990s, there were a lot of horror films that were coming out that were, becoming satires and parodies of other horror films, because this was becoming a genre where it was kind of becoming very old, and we knew how the formula was going. So there were movies kind of like Scream and Scary Movie where they were trying to, parody horror films, because yeah, like I said, this kind of thing wasn't becoming scary anymore because everybody knew the formula. And this is, like I said, a formula that they still use in today's horror films. So long story short, now we're in the 2000s era of horror films. The 2000s was quite a huge year for horror as well, where there were a lot of subgenres that became, very popular, like the torture porn genre, thanks to films like Saw and Hostel. And you had, there was a strange thing where there was a lot of American remakes of Japanese horror films in the 2000s, so you had a lot of those. We're all familiar with 2000s horror because we've all lived through it, so I really don't need to explain to you what, horror movies came out in the 2000s, because we all know. So the 2010s era, this is a very strange era or a very strange decade for horror films, simply because there's kind of horror movies coming out this decade that are trying to bring it back to, like, the old roots back in the 60s and 70s. They're kind of trying to bring that horror back, You have movies like The Babadook and It Follows and The Witch, which is basically the whole reason why I'm making this video. Those three horror films are arguably the best three horror films to come out in the 2010s. And I know a lot of people would disagree with this. There are a lot of people who hate The Babadook, who hate It Follows, who hate The Witch, because they are different. And like I said, they try to go back to being like the horror films that came out in the 1960s and 70s. But here's my main points. Horror movies in the 60s and 70s, those terrified people, like I said. Movies like Psycho and Rosemary's Baby and even Alien, those were movies that really scared people back then. And, movies like Psycho and let's say Rosemary's Baby. Let's give Rosemary's Baby an example. Say Rosemary's Baby and The Witch completely switched release dates, and Rosemary's Baby came out in 2016 and The Witch came out in 1960, or wherever the Rosemary's Baby came out. I really don't know. Somewhere in the 60s, but say those two switched. If The Witch came out in 1960, it would probably be considered a masterpiece, just like how Rosemary's Baby is considered a masterpiece today. If Rosemary's Baby came out today, people would hate this film. It is literally exactly like The Witch. It is very, very slow. A lot of people are going to find it very boring, very tedious, just very, very slow. So many people are going to be bored with it, and they're going to complain because nothing happens until the final act of the film when, shit finally hits the fan. People will hate that film if it came out today. But because of the fact that it came out in the 60s and people back then considered it to be considered it a masterpiece because it was so scary, we today still consider that to be a masterpiece today because other people back then said it was a masterpiece because they thought it was scary back then, even though we may not find it, as scary today. The Witch is just like those movies, guys. The Witch is just like Psycho, just like Rosemary's Baby, just like all those 70s psychological horror films that came out. It is just like those. It is very slow burn horror, and a lot of people just seem to not accept those anymore. Not a lot of people are accepting slow burn horror movies anymore, even though those are really the movies that, created the whole horror genre essentially. Those were the ones that, inspired so many horror movies even today, but people still hate The Witch, and that's not the only reason why. The number one thing is because nobody finds horror movies scary anymore. Let's admit it, there has not been a good scary horror film to come out in a very, very long time. Horror movies, they aren't scary anymore, and this goes back to my point where horror movies even today are starting to follow the same exact formula, and that is true. That's the reason why we're not scared of horror movies, because we've heard this story so many times before. There are so many horror movies that come out today that follow that same exact formula. And not only that, but there are a lot of horror movies, especially today, that rely on cheap jump scares and blood and gore, and they think that stuff is scary, and it's just not. And that is unfortunately what kids today, that's how, you know, they look at horror movies now. They kind of look at horror movies as a big joke, which I think is the reason why, you know, that's a huge thing to go out on a Friday night to watch a horror film with a bunch of friends, is to not be scared by it, but to rather kind of just make fun of it in a way, because it's kind of sad. You know, horror movies, they aren't scary anymore, and like I said, they rely the scares on cheap jump scares and blood and gore, which is not okay in my opinion. That is not what makes a good horror film at all. Kids today think Paranormal Activity is a masterpiece. I completely forgot to mention the found footage era. Holy crap. The 2000s is also responsible for creating the found footage genre. Well, technically Cannibal Holocaust back in the 1980s created the whole found footage thing, and the Blair Witch is kind of what made the found footage thing popular, but it wasn't until the 2000s where there were so many found footage horror films that were coming out, and there are still so many found footage horror films coming out today, and this is probably the worst subgenre of horror ever. Found footage is just, it's awful. I don't want any more found footage movies, and to be fair, I know why they make them today. I know why they make found footage movies is because back what I was saying when I said horror movies, you know, try to step up, you know, every decade and, you know, try to become scary and scarier and scarier. Well, with movies like Psycho and Rosemary's Baby, they figured, okay, these are movies that really scare people, and those are movies that have a sense of realism to them. So we're going to try to make horror movies more realistic, and that's going to scare people. So that's kind of what they did in the 2000s with movies like Saw and Hostel was... you know, those movies as well are like very real. They seem very real where, you know, real stuff like that could happen to people. But then they started making found footage movies where, you know, that was just like a whole new other level of just real. Because they wanted you to think that it's real because, you know, it's the found footage genre. It's footage that is found from people who were, you know, attacked by some supernatural being or some serial killer or, you know, however that formula goes. Like I said, we all know the story. We all know every single found footage horror film now because we know how the formula goes. But the thing is, there's so many found footage horror films coming out today that sense of realism that the Blair Witch Project had. And by the way, the Blair Witch Project is a movie that terrified people back in 1999 because people actually thought that was real. Because it was the first big found footage horror film and nobody has ever seen something like that. But then movies started coming out like Paranormal Activity, you know, and I can't even name any other found footage horror film, to be honest with you. They're all very forgettable, but they were like, okay, that movie was very scary, and, you know, a lot of people thought that was real, so let's just keep making, you know, found footage horror films because people will then think those are real. And now everybody knows they're fake because they're just not scary anymore, you know? That sense of realism worked with the Blair Witch Project, but it does not work with any other found footage film because everybody knows it's fake. You know, the whole found footage gimmick, it's pointless now. There doesn't need to be any of it. And, like I said, people just make it to scare people because it adds, you know, a whole new level of realism to horror films. And that's what scared people back in the 60s, so they kind of tried to step that up. But it just doesn't work. And honestly, I want this subgenre to stop immediately. And I want there to be more movies like The Witch and The Babadook and It Follows, because I think those are great horror films that are trying to bring, you know, horror back to its original roots, horror back to what made horror films so scary. We today, as people, forget what makes a horror movie scary. We cannot accept slow burn horror films today because we don't find them scary because we are bored by them, because we are so... you know, we are so brainwashed with cheap jump scares and blood and gore that we forget what makes a good horror movie scary. When people go into horror movies now today, all they expect are jump scares and gore. That's all they expect because that's all what every single horror film that comes out today is. And, you know, it's movies like The Witch and The Babadook and It Follows, they're trying to bring it back. They are trying to bring original horror back to its roots. And that's why the people don't find The Witch scary, because they expected it to be, you know, like a jump scare galore, bloodbath, and stuff like that. People need to realize that you don't need to have jump scares and blood and gore in your horror film in order to be scary. Which is which is why I think The Witch is a great horror film, because it is a movie that has neither of those things and still manages to be a great horror film. And I'm not completely bashing on jump scares. You know, there's movies kind of like Insidious and The Woman in Black that kind of do the jump scare thing a little right. But I'm talking about when movies use it because other movies use it because, you know, it's scary. And I hate the fact that movies today rely on jump scares to scare people. Of course the jump scare is going to make you jump, because literally all it is just a very loud sound that, you know, makes you jump because it's a loud sound. That's not scary. And most of the time it's not even something scary. That's what's called a false jump scare. It's jump scares that aren't even, you know, it's not even like a serial killer or a threat. It's just like a friend going, "Boo, I scared you," and they're like, "Oh, stop it, you." Like, that's not scary. You don't rely your horror movie on that kind of crap. But I think that's the reason why, you know, most people did not find The Witch scary, is because it didn't have any jump scares and it didn't have any blood and gore. And instead, it chose to kind of be like movies like, you know, Psycho and Rosemary's Baby, and even Don't Look Now, you know, where it kind of creates that psychological sense of horror where it's kind of messing with your head a little bit. People forgot what makes a good horror film scary, and that to me is very sad. You know, and that again goes back to my whole point with Rosemary's Baby and The Witch, where if you switch the two together, or if you switch the two, then people would hate Rosemary's Baby if it came out today because it is so slow, and people just don't know what makes a movie scary anymore, and they need to realize that jump scares and blood and gore is not scary, and that's not what makes a horror film good. And this is the same thing with The Babadook as well. A lot of people found The Babadook to be very boring because it never showed the Babadook, or it was very slow, you know, nothing happened, or whatever their excuse was. They didn't like it because there were no jump scares and there was no blood and gore. When really The Babadook is a much smarter horror film than you might think. You know, it kind of goes back to the roots of, you know, 70s psychological horror, where it relies on psychological, you know, effects to scare you, and it works. At least with me it worked, because I love that movie, you know, that's definitely one of the best horror films to come out in a while, along with The Witch and It Follows. But yes, guys, you need to realize, that's why I think The Witch is a masterpiece. That's the reason right there, because we consider Rosemary's Baby and Psycho to be masterpieces, correct? Well, I would consider The Witch to be a masterpiece because The Witch is just like those movies in creating slow burn horror and psychological horror, rather than relying on cheap jump scares and blood and gore, which is all that every horror movie that comes out today relies on. And that's the reason why I think The Witch is a masterpiece. I don't know why it just kind of like changed. Like, I was very orange before, now I'm very pale, but I don't know why my camera does that, but anyways, what was I talking about? People don't realize that what makes The Witch scary is the fear of the unknown is what makes The Witch scary. People tend to forget that the unknown is a very scary thing, and horror movies today just kind of, you know, they show everything. They show everything, and that to me is not scary. The fact that they show, you know, every single dismemberment from a limb, or show, you know, the face of a monster, you know, they just completely show everything. That's where I think horror loses its magic right there, is when you just completely show off everything. That kind of thing doesn't make it scary. What does make it scary is the sense of the unknown. You don't know what, you don't know exactly what it is, or what's, you know, what's haunting them. You don't know. And that alone to me is terrifying, is you don't know what is hunting them. You don't know what's going on. You don't know, you know, it's that kind of thing that's what's scary. And that's exactly what, you know, The Babadook and It Follows. You don't know why it's following her, or you don't know why the Babadook is, you know, terrorizing this family. That's what makes a good horror film scary, is the fear of the unknown. I think not knowing, you know, what it is that is haunting these people is much scarier than actually showing it. You don't exactly know everything in The Witch. When watching The Witch, you don't exactly know what's going on. You don't know everything. And that's what makes it scary. Not cheap jump scares, not you. Why are you doing that? Stop! Stop! And not only that, but The Witch is also a very original story, and it's very, very creative, much like Psycho and Rosemary's Baby. It's very original, you know. Try to think of a movie like The Witch. You simply can't, because it is a one-of-a-kind film. And it's creative, and it's different. And that's why people hate it, because it's different. This is the whole point of The Cabin in the Woods, guys. I don't know if you've seen The Cabin in the Woods, but it is one of my favorite horror films of all time. because of the fact that it not only is it a parody of horror films, it tells you a big message about horror films today. Big spoiler if you haven't seen The Cabin in the Woods, but in The Cabin in the Woods, so if you don't know the story, you have the 5 teenagers. This is back to the original formula that I was mentioning before, you know, the whole formula that 80s slasher film started, where you have the 5 friends go into a cabin in the middle of the woods. You know, one of them's a jock, one of them's a horny girl, another one's a kind of a smart guy, another one's a comic relief, otherwise just stoner, and the other one is the final girl, you know, the girl who at the end is the one escaping, you know, from, or trying to get away from the victim. She's the only one left alive. And the people in the little operating room underground, I forget what that little area is called, but if you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. That little operating room where, you know, people are controlling what's going on up in the, up where the cabin is, and they're controlling, you know, how the characters are feeling and whatnot. Those, metaphorically, are the filmmakers. Those are filmmakers, those are the people who make horror films. And what's going on up, you know, like, with the cabin and the 5 teenagers, that is the movie. That's a metaphor for a horror film, and the people downstairs controlling it is, you know, the filmmakers creating that movie. And again, a big spoiler if you haven't seen The Cabin in the Woods, and the gods, the ancient gods, you know, that the operating room feeds, you know, the blood to these 5 teenagers to, those gods are considered, again, they're a metaphor for the audience, and the audience is you and me and anybody who watches horror films. And the gods will only be fed the blood of the 5 generic teenagers in every horror film, because that's what they go and watch, and that's what they want to see. And so the operating room underneath, aka the filmmakers, you know, they make the horror film, you know, they control what's going on, you know, upstairs, in the movie. And, you know, at first they're successful. They created the most generic horror film ever, which is, you know, what most horror movies are today. So at first they're successful, but what happens is a turn of events where the comic relief and the final girl are the 2 only survivors, and they actually find their way to the operating room, and they wreak havoc, and they release all these monsters that the operating room has, you know, in these giant cubes, you know, these monsters that they use to make other generic horror films that follow that same formula. And this is the smartest thing about The Cabin in the Woods, is that the ancient gods will, like I said, will only be fed the blood of the generic, you know, the generic 5 teenagers in every horror film. And they will only be fed that. So if they don't be fed that in the next 10 minutes, I think the lady says, then they will end the world. They will, you know, make sure that nobody on the earth lives, and they will just completely end the world. The world's gonna end if they don't get this generic piece of crap movie. But, the comic relief and the final girl end up killing the lady, and the gods end up don't getting what they want, and the movie ends with the world ending. And that, I think, is what is so genius about The Cabin in the Woods, because it really tells you a lot about horror movies that come out today. Audiences in horror films today, aka the ancient gods in The Cabin in the Woods, they go apeshit because it's so different, and they don't get what they want, so they crap on it, because it's different from other horror films, and it doesn't follow that same exact formula, which is exactly like what people who watch horror movies think today. If people don't get the generic horror film they want with cheap jump scares and blood and gore, then they don't like it. And the fact that it's different and tries something new, like The Witch and The Babadook and It Follows, then they automatically hate it and they end the world. So that's why I love The Cabin in the Woods, is because it's a film that, like I said, it really explains, you know, modern horror movies that come out today. So guys, for those of you who hated The Witch, or for those of you who haven't seen The Witch yet, which, by the way, I highly recommend to each and every one of you go see, for those of you who hated it, give it a second chance. Please give it a second chance. And here's another thing that I'd like to bring up. A lot of people were disappointed in The Witch because of the marketing. Although I was perfectly fine with the marketing, I thought the trailer and the TV spots were perfect for the film. A lot of people, you know, it gave the idea of a horror film to a lot of people. Like, it's something that's going to be really, really scary. And that's not necessarily what it was, because like I said, it's, you know, the fear of the unknown is what makes the movie scary. But I guess the trailer and the TV spots gave people the wrong idea, and that this is gonna be, you know, a horror movie just like the Forest and the Boy, when really it's much different than that, and it's much smarter than that. But people were expecting that kind of stuff, so they didn't like it. And I wouldn't blame the movie for that. I would blame the marketing. The movie itself has nothing to do with the marketing, you know, they're not in control of that stuff. That's, you know, people who make trailers and TV spots who, you know, try to make the movie look more scary so you can go out and see it. I wouldn't necessarily blame that on the movie because the movie is not responsible for the marketing. You know, the movie is responsible for itself and not the trailers and the TV spots. So maybe you guys just had your hopes up too high, or, you know, I don't know. I don't know the case of why you didn't like it, but I'm sure it has something to do with because it's a very different horror film and it's not what you expected when really The Witch is a movie that goes back to, like, you know, the original roots of horror films where, you know, it relied on realism and the fear of the unknown and psychological, you know, kind of thing to make it scary. And that kind of thing doesn't scare any people anymore because, like I said, they're so brainwashed with, you know, cheap jump scares and blood and gore and what they think is what makes a horror film scary. And people are also debating on whether to even call The Witch a horror film. And I'm going to tell you right now that The Witch is, in fact, a horror film. Just because it didn't scare you doesn't mean it scared other people, and not only that, but there are horror elements to it. And, you know, it's like I said, that fear of the unknown is what makes the movie so scary. And, you know, the movie, it's a horror film. It's definitely a horror movie. In the same way that Rosemary's Baby is a horror movie, in the same way that Psycho is a horror movie, The Witch is a horror movie because those movies are so alike. Especially Rosemary's Baby. Rosemary's Baby and The Witch are so alike. They're both movies that kind of, the whole movie is building up to that one final act, but that build-up is kind of what makes the movie so scary. Because, like I said, it's the fear of the unknown. You don't know what's going on. You don't know what's going to happen. And, you know, it's that build-up, that, you know, that tension. But yes, guys, The Witch is a wonderful horror film. It is, like I said, a masterpiece. And I think it's a movie that is trying to bring horror movies back to its original roots. And it's trying to do something a bit different with horror movies. Which is why I say the 2010s is a weird decade for horror films. Because you do have a lot of the same generic crap coming out. But then you also have, you know, horror movies like The Babadook and It Follows and The Witch, which are trying to, you know, create something different and kind of, like I said, bring horror back to its original roots. And I'm kind of hopeful for that, honestly. I think horror it's going into a new direction. And I don't want to say that horror movies that come out today are terrible, but there's nothing new to them. They're not bringing anything new to the table. It's just the same generic crap that we've always been getting since the 1980s when that original, you know, formula started. But horror movies today, it's nothing new. We've seen the story so many times before. They're bringing nothing new to the table, which is why I think movies like The Babadook and It Follows and The Witch are movies that are trying to bring, you know, original horror back and what makes a horror movie so scary. And I just hope that we get more horror movies kind of like The Witch, because I really want to see movies trying something different. We have not gotten a good scary horror film in a very, very long time, and I really, really hope that there is a movie coming out in the near future that will bring that back. And like I said, I think it's happening very slowly, but I think horror is kind of slowly going back to its original roots, and it's slowly beginning to get scary again thanks to movies like The Babadook and It Follows and The Witch, which are three of the most different and creative horror films to come out in the 2010s. And yeah, let's just hope that there's, you know, a horror movie out there that will genuinely scare us, that will, you know, be as good as Psycho and Rosemary's Baby and Alien and, you know, stuff like that. But yeah, guys, that's why I think The Witch is a masterpiece. That's why I would give the film a 5 out of 5, officially, you know, changing my rating now to a 5 out of 5. And that's why I think each and every one of you should go see it. And don't expect, you know, the same generic crap that you usually get out today. But expect something very different and original, definitely. Maybe you'll like it a little bit more. But yeah, guys, that's it. That's basically it. I just kind of wanted to get all that off of my chest. I had a lot to say about the horror genre. And quite frankly, I really hope that it starts heading towards a new direction. I really hope so. But thank you guys so much for watching this video. I am so sorry that it was so lengthy. I just had so much to say about, you know, the whole horror genre and The Witch, and why you should all go see The Witch, and why we should all, you know, respect old-fashioned horror, because that's what really made, you know, horror movies scary back then. And we really don't get horror movies like that coming out today. So let's just hope that, you know, like I said, there will be a horror movie to bring horror back to its original roots. But yeah, guys, that's it. I'm done. That's all I had to say. Thank you guys so much for watching. I am Jacob Palacio, and I will see you guys later. Oh, and let me know if I should do more of these videos or not. It was pretty fun making. I know it's going to be a bitch to edit, but I'm sure it'll be well worth it, you know, trying to get my message out to people in horror films and whatnot. So yeah, let me know if I should do more of these or not. Just let me know what you think, and yeah, I'm Jacob Palacio, and I will see you guys later.